Hello, everyone. I am very excited to welcome you today to today's Fireside Chat EdTech Edition. Uh, we are very focused on what has been happening during COVID-19 and what's going to be happening after the pandemic. Truly, we have all been through something transformational during this time period. We have seen schools shift more this past year and a half than we've probably seen in the last 200 years. And we have a series of panels set up today to explore that conversation and see where that's taking us not only now as we return to in-person school, but the future. The first panel is set with funders and policymakers. The second panel is set with practitioners. And the third panel, we're going to bring everybody together. So I am happy to introduce my close friend, Bart Epstein, the president and CEO of EdTech Evidence Exchange, and he'll be moderating this first panel. Bart, I'll turn it over to you.
Good evening, Chris. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to see you all, and thank you to everybody who's tuned in. We have an all-star lineup of brilliant people tonight, and I'm very excited to dive in and ask them difficult questions that lead to arguing. Let's take stock of who we have in our panel. First, we have Chris Rush, Senior Advisor for Innovation and Director of Educational Technology at the U.S. Department of Education. We have Aaron Moat, Co-founder and Executive Director of Innovate EDU. We have Mark Schneider, Director of the Institute of Education Sciences at the U.S. Department of Education. And we have Michael Moe, Founder and CEO of Global Silicon Valley, also known as GSV. Let's jump right in with the first question for Michael. In recent decades, technology has transformed almost every sector of our economy. The use of technology in education is increasing sharply, but has yet to provably move the needle on measurable outcomes at a national level. What are you seeing out there now that's most intriguing and promising?
So as it relates to kind of education efficacy, it's a wonderful time to be an education entrepreneur because there's such profound needs, in the world for being able to show a return on investment for education, and I think we're able to see that more and more on a real-time basis. And so the companies that we're investing in are the ones we say there's a high, the companies that are going to create the greatest education, the greatest investment returns are the ones that have the greatest educational outcomes with AI and other, very powerful data analytics. The ability to show what's actually working in the classroom, and oh, by the way, create more personalized learning in a real-time basis, is happening in front of our eyes. And so I think what we've seen in terms of change in many other sectors around, in the world, you're seeing in education in hyperdrive today. And obviously the pandemic was a major accelerator for many of the trends that were in place before it. And now we're in a time today that I think is unprecedented.
Thank you. Anyone else on the panel want to speak up about the kinds of things that you're seeing that's most promising and intriguing for driving student outcomes?
Categories? Okay, so let me jump in here and maybe step on the answer to the question that you're going to ask me. The Institute of Education Sciences is a very large investor in education research. And our mantra is that we are dedicated to finding out what works for whom under what circumstances. The other thing that's critically important is that in all the data that we've been generating with regard to assessing student performance, the critical need is the lagging performance, the actual declining performance of the bottom performing students, the students at the 10%, 25% level of any of the national and international assessments in the United States. Their scores are actually declining. And this is a true disaster. So about 1/3 of American students are below basic in the National Assessment of Education Progress in both reading and math, and about 50% of Black students at both 4th and 8th grade reading and math are below basic. So for us, the most important part about all these innovations is the degree to which they're focused on the lowest performing students, and this include ELLs, special education students, just students that are receiving bad educations, And the question is the degree to which our technological innovations and our ed tech investments are focused on bringing up the bottom, because this is the true tragedy and the true catastrophe of American education.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to Chris. Chris, what stands between where we are today and where we could and should be 10 years from now? Do we need more raw computing power? Do we need augmented reality headsets for every kid? Do we need changes in policy? Do we need sector-wide collaboration on things like standards, common language, context, and interoperability? Do we need more training, planning time, something else? What do we need? What's on your to-do list for the whole education sector? Just a small question.
Just that small question. Well, look, I think we're going to see a lot of change between now and 10 years from now. Will we benefit from virtual reality and augmented reality headsets? Will we benefit from other data flowing? Will we benefit from some common standards? Of course, but I don't know that that stands in the way of things right now. When I look back at the last 15 to 20 years, and I think about how technology has impacted education, when I look back 20 years, I see a world where everybody was, or many people were scared of technology coming in and technology replacing teachers as opposed to technology aiding in what's happening. It really seemed to be a bit of a divide. And one of the things I see happening over these next 10 years is that more and more of the teacher workforce will have grown up with technology. They will know how to integrate it into their work instead of having it replace their work. And that fear is starting to go away more and more. And as soon as that fear starts to go away, you see the integration of some of these different practices, some of these different technologies that are coming to fruition and finding new applications for them. And it's not just people sort of in an ivory tower trying to design something, but we can really have the field participating in those activities. And I think that's going to change everything. If we wait until the next technology has been invented and then say, let's get that out to everybody, and then wait again for the next technology to be invented, we'll be waiting forever because technology moves at a pace that's rather rapid. Now, I do see one of the barriers here, though, and this is something that's on my agenda, is around access, because this can really create an increasing divide. So I think one of the things that we need to do is as technology starts to transform education, we need to make sure that we have the practices and the policies in place that can help make sure that they get applied more equitably. And that's going to be key.
Erin?
Yeah, I would just build on what both Chris and I think Mark have pointed out about equity. You know, in the next 10 years, I think we all need to commit to three things. First, that all students are connected, whether that's at home or at school. I think this pandemic taught us that, you know, the school building and the home are both environments for learning. And we need to make sure that all students, no matter what income bracket they're in, have access to best-in-class connectivity at their home and at school. We need to make sure that all students have a dedicated educational device. I think so much of what we've seen in this pandemic is for the students that Mark talked about, those students who are furthest behind, those who didn't have dedicated educational devices or where they struggled to get them, were just at a disadvantage from the beginning. And then finally, we need to be laser focused on making sure that tools are accessible and usable for all learners, including issues around accessibility for our students with disabilities and making sure that our English language learners are equipped with tools that, you know, give them the capacity to interact with education technology as part of their learning cycle.
Thank you. My next question starts with Erin. I'm sorry, does somebody want to jump in?
Yes, so sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm going to use up all my talking points before you get to me. So Chris mentioned AI. And I don't know if any of you know, but we're trying to do 2 AI institutes with the National Science Foundation. So the first one would be on AI for tutoring. And I think this is, for me, this is like a really interesting problem. So the early studies of tutoring, intelligent tutoring, were not all that successful. But we've come so far in AI, And we need to figure out how to merge AI and tutoring to be able to test in like real time what forms of tutoring work for what subjects and what students. So tutoring is like the big thing right now. Everybody believes that tutoring is the thing, and we're probably going to spend billions upon billions of dollars on tutoring. But unless we are more intelligent about the way we approach tutoring, we are not going to be able to learn to fit different styles of tutoring, different forms of tutoring, different groupings of students to maximize the effects of tutoring. So what I hope is that our work with NSF, this AI intelligent tutoring system, will answer the kinds of questions that, again, sorry, the mantra of IAS, what works for whom under what conditions. Because I think knowing that tutoring works is not satisfactory. We need to know what forms of tutoring works for which students. The second AI institute that we're trying to set up with NSF, it focuses on special education students. So the analogy here is that AI has done amazing things with regard to the medical profession. Diagnosis, describing treatments, prescribing treatments is amazing. So I don't want to over medicalize special ed, but the fact of the matter is that we need much better and more intelligent systems for assessing student developmental needs for special ed kids and for designing systems of treatment. So what happens if we can actually take some of this AI work that's been done in medicine and move it over to this lowest performing and critical population? 14% of American students are classified as special education students. And what happens if we could use AI to help with the assessment and the design of treatment programs for special education students?
Thank you, Mark.
And I'll add on there.
Go ahead, Chris.
You know, I think we really have to look at a lot of these technologies in concert with one another. So AI to help tell us what to do next and how it can augment the activities going on. But one key thing I think we learned during this pandemic is, student engagement is so key. And there are some ways in which the remote learning allowed certain students to engage in some ways for the first time in ways that they never had before. And for other students, they completely ended up sort of tuning out because they weren't able to engage. And I think as we go forward with this, we need to not only personalize the pathways that kids might go down, which AI and tutoring can help with, but we're also going to need to personalize the modalities and figure out this key aspect of engagement. Because without technology, the single modality of learning, for the most part, is one teacher sitting in front of 28 kids in a classroom, and it was really teacher-led learning, augmented with some worksheets, right, that people can do and practice problems for homework. I think technology opens up the space for those different modalities, but also for allowing multiple kids at the same time to be engaging in different ways. And I'm really excited about how those things can start to come together. I don't think we're going to see it all fully there over the next 10 years, but I think we're going to see it show up in pockets. And then our job is to take those pockets and help spread them out.
But what you're seeing today, and I think it is incredibly encouraging, is where AI truly can accelerate an individual child where they're proficient, go backwards where they're deficient, find the best way that they learn, and it can do it at a very low price or even free with some unique models. So Photomath is an interesting company that's, I think, the largest app, in math in the world, where you get your own personal AI tutor. Not only do you take your pick, you can take a photo of a math problem, and instantly not only comes back with the answer, but the way that you get there. But you need more help. You get your own personal AI robot that's helping you along the way at no or a fraction of the cost, which democratizes access to all this. So I mean that's happening today. So I think what happens 10 years from now, I think will be something we can't even imagine today.
Aaron, this conversation about all these new technologies raises an interesting question. There's now more than 9,000 ed tech products on the market. And the federal government is in somewhat of an odd position when it comes to education. We're very much about local control, and federal spending accounts for less than 8% of our national education spending. But arguably, only the federal government has a capacity to do the research on the hundreds and hundreds of promising new technologies being released into a highly fragmented marketplace. If you had a magic wand and could create legislation and funding, what would you do to support the development and equitable deployment of new technologies to understand what works where and why?
Yeah, well, I promise Mark didn't give me a quarter for this answer, but we have to strengthen IES. We need to allow Mark to ask more of those what works for whom, when, and how questions, faster, better, and with different types of research. We need to think about what the federal research and development infrastructure that underpins education looks like, so that we aren't just doing basic and applied research, but we're also doing, I think, what we've talked about here, which is directed development. Being able to take a small number of projects that are high impact and high risk, frankly, and to be championed through public-private partnerships to really catalyze change. This has worked in other segments of government in order to drive large-scale catalytic change. And part of that is strengthening the mechanisms that we have, like IES, and really allowing different types of research to come to the surface. The other thing I'd say on the funding perspective is we have a lot of school systems, I think, who need to make investments in their data infrastructure or the railroad tracks on which they run much of their ed tech and their systems. We have many schools, districts, and systems that are spending an inordinate amount of time on tasks that could be, if sort of done well, could realize an enormous amount of inefficiencies. And then finally, if I had a real magic wand, I would have the department support interoperability and privacy modernization for our systems that actually meet the needs of modern technology. I think in some ways, our innovation in education can be hampered by the fact that many vendors, education systems, school districts, technology directors, all the way down to teachers, parents, and students are still interpreting a 1970s law around education technology as one of the pillars of their ways they operate. So we gotta do something there.
Thank you. Mark, can I put you on the spot to give us a rough estimate out of the approximately 9,000 EdTech products on the market? If you had to estimate to the nearest 5%, what percentage of them has IES rigorously studied?
I would say it rounds to 0.
Well, that's concerning, and for me, at least, a call to action for all of us, because no independent school district is ever going to spend $3 million to do an efficacy research of a product that costs $100,000. So we'll put a pin in that and come back. Last
Bart,
question.
can I chime in one thing to that?
Of course.
I do think it would be helpful if the only standard of evidence wasn't a $3 million, high-end study, though, and that there needs to be a pipeline so that there are different levels of evidence that can start with something that a school who is driving a certain innovation could afford to put in place, in a way that those things can surface, so that it's not about which thing have the super high-end rigorous bit, but that you have some level of evidence and study for everything that's out there, and you can figure out which ones to invest those very large RCT research studies around. Mark may disagree with me on that, but
anyway, so Chris knows that we've had discussions about this, about levels of evidence and what actually the evidence-based decision-making means, and how far we could push it. But I want to go back to Bart's point. So it is true that I would say that it rounds to 0. I would also say that we are all enjoying the benefits of IS and ed and government investments in SBIR, the Small Business Innovation Research Program, which is one of the major sponsors, and Ed Metz, who's not on camera right now, but everybody who's tuning into this on this evening will probably have met Ed along the way. I mean, these are resources that are actually helping us move forward in this world. so here are some of the problems, right? And I know that there's solutions to these, but we haven't figured them out yet. So we can't test 9,000 products. I mean, clearly that's the case. And we are having, and you know, Bart and I have talked about this, and I'm relying more on him, and will rely more on him in the future. He and some of his colleagues about what are the biggest products out there? What are the ones that are used the most? That's where we need to focus our efforts. So we need to find the ones with the biggest market share, the deepest penetration, and then we need to figure out the most effective ways of testing those for efficacy. It may be the case that, as Chris notes, that we don't that we may have to have some more flexible standards of evidence besides RCTs, and we have a panel at the National Academies of Science that's looking at the whole research structure of IAS to try to modernize it. And one of the questions I posed to them directly was, what's the balance between RCTs and other methods? I also specifically posed to them the question of what should us as a science agency in the federal government think about with regard to pipelines and where we should invest our money in the pipeline. We spend about $90 million a year on development grants, and most of the money goes to academics. And there's the question of, you know, are these the right people for doing developments and scale up? And the answer probably is, well, anyway, we'll leave that. But no, I agree, and this discussion is just part of the transformation that that I think needs to be done. I also believe that we and some of you who follow my blogs or what we're doing in IS, we're doing more investments in high risk, high reward activities, because we do need transformation of the education research infrastructure, and we need to find things that work.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for your leadership at IES. Chris, thank you for your leadership at the Department of Education. And Michael and Aaron, for yours as well. Our time is up, so I'm going to now hand it back to Chris Rush for our second panel.
Thank you, Bart. Next, I'll be joined by three practitioners for our next panel. Garrett Brown is an elementary art teacher in Liberty Public Schools in Liberty, Missouri. Nima Avashia is a civics teacher in Boston Public Schools, and Nancy Penchev is an iLab teacher and instructional technology coordinator at Sheikh Hillel Community School in Miami, Florida. Thank all three of you so much for joining us today. And I'm looking forward to an interesting and robust and engaging conversation. So with that, I'll jump right into it. So a lot has changed over this last year. You know, the pandemic has changed whether or not we are in school, out of school, a mix of those things, who we're working with, how we do our job. And as you stop and reflect, can you share how you believe instruction and practice may have changed forever as a result of that? And can you highlight one way that you believe it may have changed for the better and one way that potentially worries you? I hope we can do a little bit of a round robin on this. Is there anyone who would love to go first?
I'll go first. So I think one of the things that has really changed with what I see in education, with the teachers that I assist and the students that I work with, is that our teachers are using a lot more of action research. They're figuring out what works. They're figuring out how they can make things better, and they're getting rid of things that don't work. And they're able to voice to administrators in a more stronger way that, you know what, this tool that you gave me and you want me to use is great, and my kids love it, and they're really moving for this. And this other tool that you provided for us, it's really not working. And so teachers are really able to jump in to evaluate what works, what doesn't work, and really give feedback to their students in a better way too, because that's one of the best things I think that came out of this was we found better ways to communicate with our students on what they're able to accomplish and what they can do to get better at what they've done. So we have lots of video tools that we're using to leave video comments on things, and we're writing emails to each other that we didn't normally do and didn't communicate in that way. And it's really giving the students a chance to advocate for themselves as well and say, oh, I see what you mean here, but I did this. Would that work too? So it really gave that action research time to figure out what worked and what didn't work, and really to build student skills as well. And I think for the future, I think it's only going to become better for students when they are able to advocate again, to really get those tools that are working best for them, and really helping teachers to find ways to engage students, no matter if they're in person, if they're in school, if they're in another room in the school. We've had that too, where we've had teachers zooming into other rooms in the school to teach. I teach math that way sometimes. So it's opened up a whole new world of things that we didn't really know would work before. And now I can zoom in from my classroom to another room to teach somebody else something that we didn't really think about before. So we're able to modify what we've done in the past and change it in a way that's really become engaging and sometimes overwhelming, but still it's really worked for what we're trying to accomplish right now. So yeah.
Is there anything that worries you?
I think overwhelming teachers. We've been on Zoom for over a year now, and we still struggle some mornings with getting kids on. I think, and so it's a lot. It puts a lot of pressure on a teacher, on a mom or a dad who's at home trying to help a child get on, and so that's a lot of pressure. So I think the stress of that can really cause issues. But I think there's also that productive struggle in it too, where we figure out what's working and we struggle a little bit, and then we come out better for it on the other end.
Gotcha. Garrett, looks like you were starting to chime in.
Yeah, I agree 100% with what Nancy had to share about productive struggle. And I think she used the term action research to talk about learning on the fly what works best in classrooms. And in the case of this year, outside of classrooms, a lot of what teachers had to figure out was, am I talking to a student who's at home? Am I face to face? Am I in some asynchronous environment on YouTube? For myself, I had to learn to teach in 3 or 4 different modalities, where sometimes it was a fixed lesson streaming on YouTube. Sometimes it was a live lesson on Zoom. Sometimes it was a live lesson face to face. And technology provided me with really a lot of possibilities on how to work smarter. There used to be discussions between teachers about the flipped classroom format. Was it wise to make everything asynchronous or not to do that? And now I feel like that discussion has kind of been closed. A lot of teachers have had to become more nimble and work smarter about how to plan a lesson, plan a project, how to get students engaged quickly, because technology hiccups may happen, and engagement maybe is really the battle. It's really trying to get students locked in, focused, so they can learn, and overcoming those technological hurdles, whether it's bad connectivity, device issues, things like that. So I don't think any of that's going away. I think that while some school districts may be changing their policies about who's face-to-face and who's virtual, I think these lessons that we've learned are going to stick with us for quite some time, 5 to 10 years. We're still going to be working on asynchronous formats, flipped formats. Where can I learn more about this teacher if I want to? Where do I go? Where are the resources? Those are the questions that students and families are going to be looking to answer, and they're looking for teachers to have those answers.
For sure. And do you feel like you have those answers?
I got to explore a lot, and that's why when Nancy mentioned action research, I feel like I got to explore so many different programs and apps and devices and camera setups and green screen models. And I'm in front of a studio space in my school now that it's a whole room designated just for shooting videos and casting out. And I'm fortunate that we're resourced well enough that there are several spaces for me to do that, and I can get proper lights and proper cameras and things like that. And so I feel like we're in an era where homes, it's going to become very common to see someone's wall in their house just painted green in the middle of the basement or in some closet somewhere, because I think we're headed in that direction when there's going to be virtual spaces as part of our everyday life for a while.
Nima, thoughts from your end?
Okay, hopefully that works. I think that something really powerful shifted in the relationship between teachers and students and families during this time. And I think that's because effectively overnight, every teacher in America became a first year teacher again. I've been teaching for 18 years, but this year felt pretty much exactly like my first year teaching in terms of the level of like exhaustion and overwhelm and not knowing if what I was doing was working or not and trying a bunch of different things all the time and having a really profound sense of humility about the fact that like none of us know what we're doing. And because we don't know what we're doing, we're really in a position to listen deeply to young people and families about what they need from their education. That shift, I think, has been really radical and really powerful. And it's something that I think you're hearing from Garrett and Nancy as well. This idea of whatever we call it, whether we call it action research, whether we call it deep listening, it's the idea that for a long time we've been doing things in a certain way that actually didn't work for a lot of young people, but it's just the way things have been. And it was really hard to shift it. And then we have this like massive, horrible disruption, but it also forces us to shift. Like we have to. There's no option. The way we were doing things before isn't possible in this context. And so people then had to really talk to young people and be like, all right, what worked? What didn't work? What am I doing right? What am I doing wrong? Like, how do I need to change things? All those questions and all that really deep interrogation that needs to happen to really support young people effectively, we were all put in the position of needing to do it. But then that also connects to my really big worry, which is I think that if you talk to educators in this country right now, a lot of us feel like the conditions on the ground in our schools need to shift really radically to support young people. But what we're hearing from policy and politicians is all about a like return to normal. And none of us want to go back to normal. Normal didn't work for too many young people. So this notion that we're just going to return to the way things were, back to 7-period days with 50-minute classes and pages of standards, like I don't think anyone who's been listening to young people and families in this moment thinks that that is what was working for them prior or is working for them right now or will work for them in the future. But I think that a lot of people in policy spaces haven't shifted their mindset around those things. And so I really worry about schools in September just continuing to replicate things that didn't work already before the pandemic.
And if you had your way, if you were the policymaker, all the other externalities aside, do you have a vision in your head for what would happen in September?
Yeah, I'm a really big fan of Jal Mehta's work. He's at Harvard. He's a professor there. He does a lot of work around deeper learning and the idea of really thinking about how we build learning spaces that are interdisciplinary, in which young people are identifying sort of what are my passions, what am I excited about, how do I choose into learning spaces that let me dig deeply into those passions and explore them and build skills through that exploration. I think we would be talking about schools where maybe you had 2 classes during a day, but each of those classes was 3 hours long. And you were doing a lot of really, really interdisciplinary work during that time, really deep project-based work. I think we would be thinking more about personalization in those ways, not in terms of like personalization as a way of getting you to move through a list of standards, but more personalization about like, what is your investment with this content? What is your investment in learning? And how do I use that as the way to bring you forward in your skills?
It sort of sounds like there was this freedom that essentially happened in teaching during this past year, despite all the other challenges going on. And while you would want to be better resourced and it wouldn't be such a taxing situation, it sounds like you'd like some spaces to still have a bit of that freedom to try something a little bit different, as opposed to sort of a more starker formula of school. Am I hearing you right?
Yeah.
Nancy, Garrett, would you add anything to this?
I totally agree that we need to listen to our kids more. I learn more from my students by watching what they're doing and letting them teach me, because they will fight to figure out something that I don't know, which is very easy to do. But like Nima said, I have a master's in instructional technology and distance learning. I have an ed specialist in instructional technology and distance learning. The first month of distance learning, I was horrible. I've been a student online. I know the best practices, but I stunk it up big time. But my kids rolled with me and they were like, well, what if we did this? And I teach third grade. I was teaching third grade math or second grade math when we first started this. And my kids were like, hey, what if we did this instead? Could we do this? And I was like, I don't know, can we? And so I just kind of rolled with them. And I would read them a book about something math related, and then they would go do it. We ran around the house looking for things that had numbers on it. We ran around the house finding things and measuring things. And you don't have to sit in a desk to learn. And I think that really helped students with this process because they're at home. Things are weird. Dad's working at home too, so they have to be quiet in their room. Mom is trying to, help the little brother get online to do his classes. There's so many things going on that we need to be flexible. And this really helped us learn some flexibility as well.
Great.
Yeah, and I would just echo what the other panelists are saying about that flexibility, that the great irony and the great gift of the pandemic in this period is that we're asking students to have growth mindsets and to fight the burnout, to fight the frustration, or at least to be honest about it. And they had to see their teachers model that very thing. I had students who had to give me tech help with how to use Zoom correctly. And since they spent sometimes more time on it per day than I did, they were able to say, well, Mr. Brown, you need to click this button and do this to spotlight this and to pin that. And there was this great kind of back and forth that normally wouldn't happen because of the normal classroom setup, that we were all in it together and we were able to support each other, not just technologically, but emotionally. And I think that was one of the gifts of this period, that I was never asking students to do something that I didn't have to model for them myself. I wasn't coming to them from a place of mastery, but it was a place of, we're doing this together. We're all learning here. We're all stretching ourselves. We're all trying to do our best to take care of each other and to do it from an equity lens. What do you need right now? I need a little bit more time, Mr. Brown. And so I'm like, that's fine. I can send you the link so you can watch the slides again. And so it was really that deep listening that the other panelists talk about. And if they had to work in a room that was quiet because a family member was nearby, I was able to, let them turn down the sound or do different things like that. So that deep listening, not just to the student, but to their family and to their community, was really key.
So we have 1 minute left or so. So I'm going to get you out of here on this front, and then we'll have the combined panel. But if you sort of had to give the one headline answer to the question of what at the federal, state, district level could we do for you as teachers that would be most helpful? The one headline answer, what would it be?
I think flexibility, that understanding that everything's not going to work all the time, and that we as teachers have lives outside of being a teacher. Surprising, I know we don't live in the school. And sometimes things are happening that we can't control either. So when we try to give flexibility to our students and understanding with our students, I think that if our leadership could also remember to give flexibility to teachers as well, I think that would be a great gift.
Right.
And not only giving it as an administrator, but instilling it in the teacher. It's okay. If you can't get this to me by Friday at 3, take the weekend. Next Friday is okay too. That flexibility.
Gotcha. Garrett, I'm gonna really enforce the 10-second one headline answer because I hear we're at time. Do you have a headline for us? And then Nima, close.
I really don't. I don't.
Well, welcome to our world then. That's fine too. Nima?
Sorry, it keeps glitching on me. I think that we need to think about how on every level above the school, we shift into a support model rather than accountability model. I think we have swung way too hard on the direction of accountability without support. And I think the time is now to move a lot closer to a support orientation and to understand that accountability without support doesn't yield anything positive. But in the context of support, then you can actually have accountability.
I love it. Well, thank you all so much. This was an exciting conversation. I feel like I continued to learn a lot of it, and I hope our audience did as well. And I look forward to, as we continue this conversation, as we go into our last panel session. Finally, I welcome Chris Deedy, the Timothy E. Wirth Professor in Learning Technologies at Harvard Graduate School of Education. He's going to help facilitate a whole group conversation so that we can bring our practitioners together with sort of our funders and policymakers in this space. So Chris, a true pleasure to see you again, and I welcome you to the conversation.
Well, this has been such a rich and interesting discussion. I want to highlight 3 themes that have emerged in a lot of the comments and then ask everyone a question. So one theme is that we're making the mistake often of starting with technology. And when you start with a technology, you say, well, it's AI, or it's VR, or it's intelligent tutoring systems. You have a solution looking for a problem, which is never a good thing. So thinking of technology as a catalyst for what? Well, for the kinds of things that the How People Learn To report from the National Research Council highlighted in 2018. We know that making deeper content more accessible to students in terms of understanding is important. If technology does that, it works. We know that active learning, as opposed to teaching by telling and learning by listening, is important. If technology enables active learning, it works. We know that we need to complement psychometric assessment, high stakes summative, with diagnostic assessment that occurs every day, that's formative for students and teachers, that produces a trajectory of knowledge about what's happening. If technology does that, it's great. We know that often students don't see the relevance of what's happening in school to what they see happening in their lives. If technology links classrooms and lives, that's great. So I think starting with what the pain points are, and then bringing in technology as a catalyst that may be able to help, is a productive way of thinking about these things. The point was made, and rightly so, that the people who are most affected by the deficiencies in our educational system are students who've been marginalized by society in many different ways. And the system is not working for them. And there's this sort of false nostalgia for going back to face-to-face classroom learning as if it had been working for them, but it isn't. So adaptive individualization through tutoring is a step in the right direction, but I like the framework that Leap Innovations in Chicago has developed for personalization. Now that's a term that has been bastardized into many meanings, but what makes personalization different than adaptive learning is the agency on the part of the student voice, the student choice, the student leadership. As somebody who sent his kids to Montessori school, I know that even 3-year-olds can learn voice and choice and still succeed in terms of meeting standards. So that's another theme that we need to think about. How can technology help us personalize? One of the big questions that we discussed that school districts face is what do you pick out of this menu of possible innovations? And what makes that complicated is that you're always having to adapt. In the real world, we never have all the conditions for success that designers and researchers had when they created something, and all the conditions for success that an RCT demands. So what if my teachers aren't so prepared? Or what if my students are only coming part of the time? Or what if it's one device for 2 students rather than one device for each? What can I expect from the innovation under those circumstances? And one of the things that I hope IES will move towards is what's called component-based research that's widely used in other fields outside of education, where you start to understand, if you've got an innovation, how much of it is dependent on the teacher professional development, how much of it is dependent on the technology access, how much of it is dependent on the content training, and so on and so on. But the question I want to throw out for the panel, and I really liked what all of the practitioners said, is how do we keep the good things that have happened in the last year? We know that there have been glitches and problems, but I and 5 other faculty members started a series called Silver Lining for Learning that's now in its 57th episode, where we were highlighting bottom-up innovations that were taking place in education across the world because the pandemic disrupted the dead hand of the past, and it disrupted the compliance mentality of the present. And so there was a silver lining to this terrible human tragedy in terms of educational change. We really want to think about the future as both and rather than either or, back to the old model. And we know that there's a lot of command and control in education, and what was disrupted by that pandemic was what enabled all the innovations that the teachers talked about being excited about. So how do we keep both and? What are some of the kinds of strategies that we can see at the policy level, at the research level, at the industry level, at the practitioner level, at the leadership level, all the stakeholders, families? What can we all do together to try to keep what improved and yet retain the best things about the older model?
I think one of the things that we have to do is share what worked. We have to create that community and continue to share, either through Instagram, through Twitter, through Facebook groups, through lots of personalized talking to each other, sending emails to your friends and texts to your friends. And it's like, I did this, it worked, you try it. So sharing those things that work, that's what's going to help continue it and get it to more and more students.
I don't know. Sorry, Chris, did you want to?
No, just jump in, please.
I think one of the most profound things that I heard a student say during this time when we were asking a lot of questions about what was working and what wasn't working is that the young person said, the problem isn't school. The problem is everything that's happening to me outside of school. And I think that probably the most significant shift that we were able to make as a school community this year is really figuring out how to provide direct aid to families. So if a family needed food, we were figuring out how to get them grocery gift cards. If a family lost housing, we were figuring out how to support them in finding housing. Schools really took on a massive element, and always have, but even more in this context, very, very, very deep work of providing direct aid to families and filling in the gaps in our safety net as a society. And so I think when we're talking about our most struggling learners or the young people who've had the biggest challenges in accessing or thriving in education, if we're not honest about the way that poverty and inequity are the drivers of that, we're not going to get to the solutions. Technology isn't the solution to that. Money is, aid is, policy is. The policies that directly address poverty are the things that are going to help young people to access education in different ways. And so that, to me, is the thing that we need to really figure out moving forward, is how are we doing a better job of getting the supports to the families that need them the most.
So if I look at one of the positives in a horrific situation is the fact that a new muscle was developed by a bunch of different people, stakeholders in the educational ecosystem. And while there's a lot of pain involved in developing that muscle now is there to be leveraged. I think when you look at some of the greatest issues in terms of giving everybody an equal opportunity to participate in the future with a foundation, which is access to education, a lot of friction can be removed from the process, whether friction's cost, geography, so forth, by being able to combine different types of learning solutions enabled in part by technology, including getting best of class content, instruction, as well as other tools that can dramatically equalize the learning experience for all and be able to tangibly show what, in fact, students are learning.
I'd also add that we've really seen during this pandemic the difference between simply making something available and properly supporting and implementing it. And there's a huge difference. And the question that I didn't get to ask Mark was about the difference between how technology is often used between upper income and lower income students, with upper income students having access to maker technologies and coding and robotics and media creation. And it's really got to be table stakes for us as a society, I think, to ensure that every student has a baseline of technology and support and a safe environment. No student can learn when they're hungry or afraid or being bullied. And once those things are in place, then we need to know more about their contexts. And that's what I heard from the practitioners about how different things work in different places. And sometimes you need more training. Sometimes you need interoperability between a product and a learning management system. And we need ways to incentivize and support our practitioners who have this valuable information in their heads so that they can share it. And that's something that we are trying to work on at the EdTech Evidence Exchange and the University of Virginia. But it's hard work because our system is so fragmented and our teachers are so busy and we're asking so much of them.
I think Bart hits on a really important point about actively listening to our teachers. And I think that echoes what our practitioner said about actively listening to students. I think one thing we need to preserve is this permission to personalize. And so, Nancy, you talked about it with students driving their learning. Nima, you talked about it with schools being able to actually personalize the support they have for students. We had guidance counselors, do home visits to complete the FAFSA. That wasn't something that was allowed before. But if we're going to get our 12th graders into college, they got to get the FAFSA in on time. And so there was this permission to do things differently and to honestly privilege relationships with students and families in a completely different way. And for me, what personalization is it's not technology. It's about putting the relationship between the student and the teacher, the family and the school at the center of our work. And when we actually do that, we can do a lot, because when students embrace their own learning, then they'll drive the passion that gets them to complete things, to get them to complete that FAFSA, to sit for that AP exam in the middle of a global pandemic. Families will do whatever it takes, including driving their kids to a Taco Bell to get internet connectivity, if that's what it takes. And we had to activate those relationships and personalize that support in a way that's never happened before. And I think that is something we need to figure out how to keep at the center of our work. Students need to be the center of the work.
Anyone else? Well, let me close with a little exercise that we like to use at Harvard. It's called I Used to Think, but Now I Think. And let's take the I used to think as being pre-pandemic, last February. And now I think where we are at this point, a year and a quarter later. And I'll start just to model this. I used to think that improving education was about curriculum, teaching, and assessment. But now I think that centering on learners and empowering learners is exactly the right way to improve education. Anybody else got I used to think, but now I think to share?
I used to think it was going to take many, 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 many years, decades to have transformative impact in education before Corona, what we call BC. I now believe we can achieve that in much more rapid time for a variety of reasons, not of which are easy, but all the opportunity is staring us in the face. We call this AD, after the disease, and I think it's wildly encouraging for giving this opportunity to give everybody an equal opportunity to participate in the future.
I think for
Well,
myself
I'm not sure
and other teachers that we also used to think that we could do it all. And then after this, we've realized we need to rely on a lot of people to help us and to get us where we really need to be.
So I used to think that the pace of education research was slow. Now I think it's very slow.
I agree with that. I used to think that it was politically undoable to have schools provide real wraparound services and direct poverty alleviation support. And I now believe that it is not only possible, but that they are arguably the best situated of our institutions to do that because they're the closest to the students.
Yeah, I would say I used to think that schools were a cornerstone of our democracy, and I now think they are the cornerstone of our democracy.
I used to think it was going to take 20 years for schools to really embrace and adopt doing something differently or technology, and now I believe that it might have already happened, and the future is the past, and it's amazing.
I used to think that I was a teacher educating students. Now I feel like I also am a student and I'm collaborating with other students and we're all learning together.
Yeah, I used to think that it would take a lot for teachers to shift from being a sage on a stage to being a facilitator of learning. And what I've learned is they're both willing to get off the stage and they're eager to jump in and be that facilitator, harbor master, lighthouse to direct students, but also to empower students with tools to really drive their own learning. I can't wait to see what educators do if we give them the flexibility that Nancy's asked for, the positivity and the support that so many of our practitioners have talked about today.
Chris, I think we're close to out of time, so I'm going to turn it back to you to close this out.
Great. Thanks, Chris. And thanks, everybody, for such an engaging, thoughtful conversation. I think we heard so many interesting themes and takeaways here. The need for flexibility, how people can sort of pull together, how it's not technology for technology's sake, and we shouldn't start with the technology, but we should start with the problems that are particularly there. How many people are rowing to try to make things better, but we're not sort of all rowing in the same direction. And we need to figure out how to support one another rather than sort of look for accountability and police one another. I think there's so many rich themes within this conversation. I just want to thank everyone so much for engaging, all of our panelists. And I want to thank all of you for joining the Ed Games Expo Fireside Chat session, the viewers out there. We hope you enjoy the other events this week. We hope educators and students can try out many of the learning games and technologies and many of the practices that they're hearing from all of these sessions. So thank you so much, everyone, and we look forward to the future.